Our sermon lesson, our gospel reading from Luke chapter 6. This is part of Jesus' Sermon on the Plain. We're maybe very familiar with his Sermon on the Mount. His Sermon on the Plain was similar themes of what he was preaching to the people. It was just in a different place. And so Jesus is speaking to a group of people, and he says this: "But to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. If someone slaps you on one cheek, turn to them the other also. If someone takes your coat, do not withhold your shirt from them. Give to everyone who asks you, and if anyone takes what belongs to you, do not demand it back. Do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. And if you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be repaid in full. But love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, because He is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, will be poured into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured to you." This is God's word. Dear brothers and sisters in Christ, I want you to, I know we do this from time to time, but I want you to do your best to try to put yourself in the shoes of someone living in Israel, a Jewish person living in Israel at the time of Jesus, to see things from their perspective. And so in order to do that, I kind of want to paint the picture of what that might have been like to some degree, so that we might get an idea of what these words might mean to them. So if you were a Jewish resident of Israel during the time of Jesus, you would have been living at a time when the main world power was the Romans. And the Romans, in terms of world empires, were probably the strongest one up until that point of history. There had never been an empire like them that had that kind of control over their empire. And if you're a Jewish person living in Israel that's dominated by the Romans, it's kind of difficult, because that was land that at one time was yours. It belonged to the Jewish people. There was a time when the Jewish nation, the Israelites, were great, when David was king, when Solomon was king, but it's not the way it is anymore. These foreigners, these Romans, had come in and conquered, and now you lived under them. And living under them was not always the easiest thing, because you lived under their kings and their governors. You had no say in that governance. On top of that, you were subject to all of the different things that government wanted to impose upon you, which meant taxes and tributes. These were sometimes pretty steep. If you add those to the already instituted religious tithes that the Jewish people were doing, the financial burden that the Jewish people had at that time was pretty heavy. But it wasn't just economic tensions, pressures. It wasn't just political. It was religious too. It was societal. Religious in the sense that the Roman government was pagan, and did not take too kindly to the Jewish religious practices. There was a whole lot of religious persecution. And societally, it was difficult, because if you're living under this power and you're a Jewish person, there are some Jewish people that compromised with the Romans. But then there were other Jewish people that saw compromising with the Romans as being the worst possible thing you could do. And so there was even division among the Jewish people themselves. It was not an easy time to live. And although, grand scheme of things, it was fairly peaceful in that there weren't major wars going on at this time, there was always the looming threat of violence, because the power that the Roman government had, the Roman military had, was great. And it was so great that they would respond in brutal force to any even small hint of an uprising or rebellion. And so the Jewish people kind of got used to, if there was a small hint of rebellion, that there would be mass arrests, public beatings, even crucifixions. Those became kind of commonplace to maintain the rule and order. That's how the Romans operated. As a Jewish citizen, you had no legal rights or protections. So you're kind of on your own in some way, shape, or form, and you lived under the oppressive reality of your enemies, the Romans. So with that context, I want you to hear Jesus' words again. Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. So Jewish people were supposed to love those who made it difficult for them financially to survive. So Jewish people were supposed to do good to those who persecuted them for what they believed. So Jewish people were to bless and pray for those who were harsh to their family member and friends. Yeah. And so are you and I. And I want you to hear specifically what Jesus is saying, because Jesus is saying far more than don't retaliate. He's saying far more than just ignore your enemies, just block out the haters. Jesus says, love them. That's active. Jesus says, do good to them. That's active. He says, bless them and pray for them. Those are things that you actively do for someone else. So you're not just ending the cycle of violence and hate and retaliation, but you are actually loving, doing good, blessing, and praying for them. This picture that Jesus is painting, in theory, it's beautiful, right? In practice, it sounds very difficult, if not impossible. In practice, we might come up with our own different ways that this doesn't quite work, right? Because if I am going to love my enemies or do good to them or bless them, pray for them, then chances are that I could be taken advantage of in that situation, right? Chances are somebody could walk all over me. They could use my generosity and those good things that I am doing. They could kind of use that against me, right? Jesus thought of that. He thought of that. He said, well, if someone slaps you on the one cheek, which is not just hurtful, but a sign of disrespect, turn to them the other also. Or if someone takes your coat, do not withhold your shirt from them. It's a step further even, right? He's saying, be willing to inconvenience yourself for your enemies. Be willing to give something up for your enemies. Be willing to do something even if you don't get something in return. Be willing to take some insults from people, take abuse from people. Now, I should stop here for a second and say Jesus isn't saying that if you are in an abusive situation that you should stay there. I want to make that clear. He's not saying that if you are in an abusive relationship that you must stay in that and put your own safety at risk. That's not what he's saying. What he's saying is the kind of love that he's calling you to is a love that's different than the world around you. It's not love for those who love you, but it's love for those who mistreat you, those who hate you. It's love that's not rooted in or motivated by who that person is, but it's motivated by something else. Because there's a big difference, right? There's a big difference between loving your enemies and loving those who are close to you. So let me give you an example. If you are putting a lot of love and work into making dinner for your family, right? And then you put that meal that you work so hard on in front of your child, and they don't eat it, they throw it on the ground, they feed it to the dog, they maybe even insult your cooking or something like that, right? You take a breath, you have patience, love, compassion, and you respond in that same way, and that's good. It's good, and it pleases God the Father. You go to a family function, and a family member says something hurtful to you, and it really does hurt. But you take a breath, you're patient, you absorb that, you don't respond in kind, but you respond with compassion and love. You don't treat them differently than you did before. That's good. It's good, and it pleases God the Father. But Jesus is talking about something even different than that. He's not talking about loving someone who loves you back, loving someone that you have a pretty good relationship with, but they slipped up once, right? Or they made you angry once. He says, if you do that, if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even unbelievers do that. That's what he means when he says sinners. He's saying unbelievers. Even unbelievers do that. Even unbelievers naturally love those who love them. Even unbelievers do good to those who treat them well. Even unbelievers lend to those who they expect repayment from. That really doesn't make you different. That's the kind of love that's common. Everybody does that kind of love. But the love that Jesus is calling you to is above that. It's much higher than that. He says, show love to those who hate you, who talk bad about you to your face and behind your back, who make your life difficult, who go out of their way to make sure that your life is hard. He says, love them. And love, not in the feeling sort of way, but love. Love like Jesus loved, selflessly, self-sacrificially, unconditionally. If you've gotten to this point, listening to this and thought, that's impossible, you're not alone. If you've gotten to this point and you've thought of all the different ways that you haven't done that, same here. This kind of love is not something that can spring naturally from within us. It's not something we can conjure up if we work really hard. This is a love that's not natural to anyone. It has to come not from within us. It has to come from somewhere else. It has to come from outside of us. It has to come from God. That kind of love that shows love to enemies without expecting anything in return, that's love that has to come from God, that it flows from God to us, through us, to others. And can I give you 3 extreme examples to show you that this is love that has to come from outside of us? The first example is a guy named Graham Staines. There was a guy named Graham Staines. He was an Australian guy who was a missionary. He was a missionary to India, and he worked specifically in helping people that suffered with leprosy. There was still leprosy in India. And so he was ministering to them, and he would also teach them about Jesus, too. And he did that for many years with his wife there. Well, there was a weekend in January in 1999 when him and his 2 sons, who were 10 and 6, they had gone to a Christian camp. But they didn't have tents, they didn't have a cabin to stay in, and so they slept in their station wagon that night. Well, late in the night, an extremist group led by a man named Dara Singh surrounded the station wagon, started verbally abusing them, and then started the car on fire and killed all 3 of them, Graham and his 2 sons. Gladys, who was the wife of Graham and the mother of those 2 boys, she didn't respond with bitterness or anger. I'm sure there were all kinds of emotions from within here, but here's what she said. She said, I have only one message for the people of India. I'm not bitter, neither am I angry. But let us burn hatred, meaning let us get rid of hatred, and spread the flame of Christ's love. She kept working in India until the day she died. Second story is a guy, you might have heard of this guy before. His name is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a German pastor who lived in Nazi Germany during World War II. And he stood strong in his faith while many others compromised at that time. And he strongly opposed Hitler's regime. Because of that, he was arrested by the Gestapo in April of 1943 and sent to a prison in Berlin. He spent 2 years there. He was treated very harshly by the guards, but he prayed for the guards regularly. He ministered to some of the guards, and he ministered to a bunch of the prisoners who were there. One of the guards was quoted as saying, "Bonhoeffer always seemed at peace. He cared more for others than himself." After 2 years of being there in April of 1945, just 2 weeks before the war was going to end, Bonhoeffer was transferred to a concentration camp, sentenced to death, and executed. And before he was executed, he prayed for his executioners and is said to have gone to the gallows with peace and confidence. And his last words were said to be, "This is the end, for me, the beginning of life." Story number 3. On June 17th, 2015, a young man went to a Bible study at a church in Charleston, South Carolina. He was there for an hour in this Bible study until he pulled out a gun and he killed 9 people in that church. 2 days later, in the courtroom, something happened that blew everyone's mind. There were lots of newspaper articles written about this. But the people whose loved ones had died forgave him. Several people forgave him. One of them, Nadine Collier was her name. Her mom had died. She said, "I forgive you. You took someone very precious from me, and I'll never get to talk to her again, but I forgive you and have mercy on your soul." It stunned everyone in the courtroom and across the nation. There were, like I said, a lot of newspaper articles written. How could somebody forgive someone like this? That kind of love is not natural. It doesn't come from this world. It doesn't come from within us. It has to come from God. It has to come from God to us. It's love that's out of this world. This is the love that the Father has lavished on us, that you and I should be called children of God, which we weren't always. We were enemies of God, enemies who belonged to sin and Satan. And so God sent His only Son to die for His enemies, to die for you and me, so that we would no longer be His enemies, but that we would be sons and daughters of God. While we were still sinners, Paul says, Christ died for us. He came and took all kinds of abuse, verbal and physical. He came and suffered in the worst possible way so that we could be no longer His enemies, but part of His family. You know the mercy of God. You know how deep that mercy is. At least you know that it's so deep that you'll never really get to the bottom of it. God says, "Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful." And the good news is, you don't have to manufacture that love on your own. That love flows from the cross. It flows from God to you. So you may have opportunity to love in big, grandiose ways, like Gladys, like Dietrich, like Nadine. But probably more likely, you'll have opportunity in your life to replace bitterness with thankfulness and compassion. More likely in your life, you'll have the opportunity to replace anger with patience and joy. More likely, you'll have the opportunity to love those who are unlovable because you know the love of Christ and the love that He's shown for you. Jesus help you to do that. Amen.